Continuing the end of Chapter 3, Ring of Bells. Within a day or two of meeting the Americans, we found ourselves, Muddy, Carl, me, and the choir school children, in a camp, a sort of refugee camp for displaced persons. That was what they called us. Peter did all he could to stop them from taking us away. He told them how Muddy had helped him to escape, told them the whole story, but rules were rules, they said, and that was that. All displaced Germans were being gathered up into camps. Before we were loaded up and driven away in an army truck, they gave us a few moments to say goodbye to him. And that was when he pressed his compass into my hand and told me that he promised he would go on looking for Marlene. Muddy was there, so was Carla, but I remember I could not help myself. When it came my turn to say goodbye, I clung to him and cried. He whispered in my ear that he would write and that he would come back for me and find me. The last I saw of him as we were driven away, he was standing there in the rain, in his uniform again now, waving us off. I thought my heart would break. We all lived for 6 months or more in that camp. When I think about it now, it was not so bad, I suppose. There was no privacy, none, that was the worst of it, and I hated living behind barbed wire, unable to go where I wanted and do what I wanted. The huts were overcrowded, but they were warm and dry at night. Defeat was a bitter blow to many of the soldiers and refugees, but for our family I have to say that the end of the war and the death of Hitler came as a great relief. We learned that life goes on. Among the thousands of prisoners there were many musicians and actors and poets. They produced plays, gave concerts, it broke the tedium of captivity. For an hour or two we could simply forget everything. The best concert for me, without any doubt, was when the choir school children gave a performance for every one. They sang mostly the folk songs we had sung together through those long nights, tramping through the dark. They knew our family favorite was "I Walk Through a Green Forest." I was quite sure, and so was Muddy and Carly, that they sang it specially for us. Muddy decided for a while that what was needed in camp was a school for all children, including the choir school children, and needed my help, she said, to look after Decline, the little ones. It kept us both busy and feeling useful too, and that was so important. Most important of all, though, to me in my time in the camp were the letters I got from Peter. I always wrote back the same day to some address in London. He was always full of good news and great plans, and how once things had settled down and he could leave, he would come back and fetch me, and we were going to get married and live in Canada together. We would go canoeing and fishing. He could not wait to show me the salmon and the black bears and everything in the Canadian wilderness that he had told me so much about. When we were all at last released from camp, we had to say goodbye to the choir school children. It was a tearful parting. They had become almost like family to us. The authorities only let us out because we had an address to go to. Muddy took us to live with a cousin of hers in Heidelberg and had one room overlooking the river. We could see the sun setting over the town. Renette was Muddy's oldest cousin and a schoolteacher and a bit strict and prim. She did her best to be kind to us and tolerant, but she was used to living alone, and sometimes I think she found it difficult to hide her irritation with us. Even though we were now free and life was returning to some kind of normalcy, this was the worst time of all for me because Peter's letters just stopped coming. I had sent him our new address, but he never wrote again. And Muddy, too, was as unhappy as I had ever seen her. Every day she went to ask the authorities of news for Poppy, and there was none. Both the men we loved had disappeared, and I'm sure this is why I became closer during these days to Muddy than ever before. And Carlyle? Poor Carlyle cried every night for Poppy and Marlene, but he got on much better than either Muddy or me with Renette, and would tell her again and again all his stories about Marlene and our miraculous escape across Germany. In the end, we managed to find ourselves a little apartment nearby. Renette arranged for Muddy to teach at her school and found places there for Carlyle and me. She went back to school. It seemed strange to be back at school again after so much had happened. I was so full of sadness by now that I found studying impossible. But then came the glad news that Poppy was alive, and he had been taken prisoner by the Russians over a year before. We did not know when he would be home, but he was alive, and that was all that mattered. We cried for joy when we heard, and Muddy sat us round the table for a family moment. Now I knew that Poppy was safe. I prayed only for Peter. Every time the postman came I would run out to meet him and ask if there was a letter. I kept writing, kept begging him to write back, but no letter came. I began to give up all hope of seeing him again. Then one afternoon, it was a few months later, we were on our way back from school and had just turned the corner into our street when I saw there was someone sitting on our front doorstep with a suitcase beside him. He stood up, took his hat off. It was Peter! The trouble was I had to share the hugging with Muddy and Carlyle. "Why didn't you write?" I cried. Not that it mattered now. Peter told me later that when he had left England and gone back to Canada, they just had not sent my letters on. They had all turned up one day at his home address in Canada in one big parcel. And that was how he knew where to find us. Maybe you have guessed the rest. We got married. In Helderberg it was. You should have heard the bells ring out. A week or so later the two of us sailed for Canada. I hated to leave Muddy and Carly, but Muddy insisted. We have very few chances for happiness in this life, she said. You take it. Go. Carl told me as he said goodbye that he would come and live in Canada when he was older. And he did, too. Sometimes all really is well and ends well. It took another 4 years, though, for Poppy finally came home from Russia. Muddy wrote that he was thin, but that she was feeding him up, and that soon as he was well enough they were going to apply for visas to come to Canada and join us in our little town not far from Toronto. So that is how we all came to live here in Niagara on the lake. Peter was acting in theater here and getting bigger parts all the time. And I became a nurse, like your mother, Carl. Life was good. Cold in winter, but good. Peaceful, contented, but that is not quite the end of it. One summer evening, we would have been in our 40s now, I suppose, Peter and I went to the circus in Toronto, a traveling circus from France. Peter always loved to watch clowning. He had a clown costume himself, and he would perform at children's parties sometimes. But right away it was not the clowns that interested me. The star of the show was an elephant, and I knew as soon as I set eyes on her it was Marlene. And the extraordinary thing was that she knew me, and she was led around the ring in a grand parade. She stopped right by me where I was sitting in the front row and reached out her trunk towards me. I felt her breathe on me. I looked into her weepy eye. It was her. There was no doubt about it. We went round back afterwards and talked to the circus people, and they had bought her from another circus 10 years before. They had no idea where she had come from before that. They said she was the best elephant they had ever had and that she had quite a sense of humor. I told them our whole story then. They cried, and we cried. We spent long hours with her for the whole of that weekend. Spent long hours with her for all weekend, just talking to her, telling her about our lives, how Muddy and Poppy had passed away within months of each other a while ago now, and how Carlisle was making films. Now he could still do his juggling. The morning the circus was packing up to leave town, we were there to wave her off. We cried again, of course we did, but at the same time. We were not sad at all, just happy we had met up again, and that she had survived as we had, and that it was all well with her. I have been on my own for a while now, the only one left. Peter and I were married for almost 60 years. I cannot say we never had a cross word. We had our problems and our sadness too. Everyone does. No children. I should have liked children of my own, but we were happy as anyone has the right to be happy. And this is Peter's compass. Lizzie held the compass out to Carl. Yours now, Carl, she said. I tried to protest, but she put it in Carl's hand and folded his fingers over it. You keep it, she said. You look after it, and look after my story too. I should like people to know about it. Oh, and do not forget to bring me my photograph album tomorrow, will you? I could see she was completely exhausted. I think she was asleep before we left her. When I came to work the next morning, school had been canceled because of the snow, and Carl was with me. We had Lizzie's photograph album with us. We sat on either side of her bed while she talked to us through her photos. one or two of the family down on the farm, one of her wedding day in Hildburg, and some of Peter in the theatrical costumes, several of them both, then in the new city of Dresden. And look, she said, turning triumphantly to the last page, this is Marlene and me at the circus that day. Do you believe me now? I've always believed you, Carl told her. Always? Always, said Carl. And you? Lizzie asked, looking at me knowingly. Almost always, I replied.